Welcome to ACC Nation, featuring sports news and special guest interviews. Here's Will Ojanen and Jim Quist.
Conor O'Neill, the publisher of Deacons and Devils Illustrated on the Rivals Network, is a special guest. He's joined us to talk about a recent article he penned for Devils Illustrated. And to quote Kenny Banya from Seinfeld, as I said on Twitter, it's gold, Jerry. Gold. The article, my take, who else should have been invited to ACC meetings? I was laughing forever over reading that. I had to go back a couple of times and read it again because honestly, it was just so spot on. So I went, we got to have Conor on to talk about this and just share some of his thoughts on this stuff. This whole thing started with what could best be described as a questionable invitation by the ACC to their spring meeting. Provide us some context, if you would, sir.
Yeah, I realized when I was walking the dog this afternoon that I forgot to do this, but it all stemmed from an Andrew Carter tweet, great journalist with the Raleigh News and Observer. He put it out there that Joe Lunardi was invited to ACC spring meetings down there in Amelia Island, this really swanky resort where all the basketball coaches and football coaches and then all kinds of administrators, all the ADs are down there. It's always this launching point into the summer, right? And it seems like there are a lot of high-level conversations that happen around those 2 or 3 days down there in Amelia Island. Andrew put it out there that Joe Lunardi was invited to talk to the league's men's basketball coaches about how to get more teams into the NCAA tournament, which is this is like an onion. It's got layers to it, right? It's funny because Joe Lunardi is one of the most outspoken critics of the ACC in recent seasons. He's one of the ones touting the Mountain West as a better league than the ACC. And then he's kind of nowhere to be found, and it's crickets when the ACC outperforms seeds 3 years in a row and gets underseeded teams to the Final Four, and Clemson makes a run to the Elite Eight. So it's funny on that level. It's also funny on the level that, I'm going to echo some of what Steve Forbes said during the basketball season. I have respect for Joe Lunardi and the fact that he basically birthed I don't know if you can call it a profession. I think it's more of a hobby, and you have to be really dialed into the hobby to be any good at it at all. But Joe Lunardi is the godfather of bracketology, as far as I know. I don't know anybody that was predicting the field on his level before he was doing it about 2 decades ago, is I think when he started. He's now the 118th best bracketologist out of 179 that are ranked on Bracket Matrix. So about 2/3 of the people that do brackets are better at doing them than he is. So if you're going to seek expert opinion and expert advice, would you not go to someone ranked better than 118? And I understand there's more of a level-headed discussion to have there and talk about Joe Lunardi as an ESPN employee. The league is in bed with ESPN, with the ACC network being carried by ESPN. You understand why it happened the way it happened, but that doesn't absolve it from us being able to make fun of it and laugh at it. And I decided to take it several steps further and suggest some other people that could be brought in.
We're gonna get into that in just a moment. This is the only thing that came to mind when you pointed out Lunardi. You can take from that what you want. I'm not going to say it, but I think I showed it. There's a lot of other people on this list, and some comments that were made on X, Twitter, whatever. I'm not going to get past Twitter. Sorry, I hesitate to call it X, but anyway, there were some comments on there on a couple of other people, 2 people in particular that we definitely have to sneak in at some point, because honestly, looking at those, I was like, holy smokes, man. These are all so on point. And start out with some of these guys that you've got on here, because this list is ripe, man. I mean, ripe.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit of a prisoner of my age. I'm 35, and I've covered the league for the past 12 years or so at various levels, right? Like for the 5.5 years that I worked at the Burlington Times News from about 2012 to 2017, I would parachute into games, but I didn't have a beat. And then since 2017, I've kind of had the Wake Forest beat through several different publications, and then I've picked up the Duke beat over the last 3 years. And it is, I mean, I'm sure somebody else from outside of Tobacco Road can look at the list and say this is too Tobacco Road heavy. There needs to be more Florida State. There needs to be more this or that. But I'm a prisoner of my age, and I'm a prisoner of what I've seen. I'm a prisoner of where I live, and where I've lived for, counting college now. Gosh, it's 17 years in this state for me. I wanted to hit the referees because everybody knows referee names, and that's one of the things about the ACC that predates me. I mean, you'll always have a couple characters that you know as far as referees go, and who's the number one character among ACC refs right now? It's Teddy Valentine. So I wanted to get him in there to lead it off. And like I said in there, like if it's just a discussion about how to be a good referee, then it's not satire, because I think Ted has there are misconceptions about Ted. Ted is a good and fair ref. Where Ted bothers me and he rankles, I imagine, some others in the media, I imagine some coaches,
Everybody.
is everything gets to be about Ted. Mm-hmm. There's always a moment or two in every game that Ted does that it's look at me, spotlights on me. So that's why he's going to come in and talk about how to not make the game about himself.
Spot on, man.
We'll never forget him turning his back on, was it Joel Berry?
I believe it was Joel Berry. That was one that I'll never forget. I think it was down at Georgia Tech, where this past year Carolina fans really have a problem with him because he swallowed his whistle on a late call and didn't give a call to RJ Davis, and that's why Carolina lost down there. I also remember, I threw it in there, I remember him inadvertently tripping a player, and I can't remember what it was about. I don't know if he was out of position or if it was just one of those things, but because it was him, like it was that much more magnified. Look, man, like this is all in good fun.
Are you sure that wasn't Grayson Allen in
Oh,
sorry.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep my composure here with that one.
That's a name that didn't quite register, but there are a few on the editing room floor that I had to lop off. I felt like it was getting too long and didn't want to bog people down with too many names to read. But the other ref on there I went with was Carl Hess.
Oh, yeah.
Because who could ever forget King Carl?
King Carl.
And that one will land home with my audience, if my audience is more Duke and Wake fans, because the thing that pushed Carl finally over the edge and out of the league was him telling Mitch Shaw back 9 years ago, Mitch Shaw was, quote unquote, just a Wake Forest Board of Trustees member and one of their biggest donors. Now he's one of their front-facing, like, biggest financiers of their NIL deal for basketball. There's a whole other story about, Mitch Shaw is a reason that Wake is able to bring in some of the players they're able to bring in. One of the reasons that Hunter Salas is coming back to Wake for his senior year. But back 9 years ago, it was Carl Hess telling Mitch Shaw that, like something about after he retired, he wanted to sit in his seat and watch his Egyptian ass ref a game and see if he could do better. And I'll always remember this. And I've hashed this out with Brett Strelo, a former newspaper guy who's now out of the business. But if you remember all the way back to 2015, both of us swear the only reason that it was like percolating even remote thought in Carl Hess's mind about calling someone an Egyptian was because I think in the previous month we had the Rick Pitino game where he was accused of running up the score, and he said that, "What do you want me to do? I've got 4 white guys and an Egyptian out there." And there's not, like, I don't submit to coincidence. I think for whatever brain chemistry was going on in Carl Hess's mind there, he equated that from Rick Pitino in the previous month to apply it to Mitch Shaw, who, by the way, the punchline here is Mitch Shaw is of Indian descent.
Mm-hmm. I can see that. I think you and Brett are on something there. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Now, him saying it doesn't make a lot of sense, but we don't have to deal with that any longer. So that's a good.
No, I mean, and like, if that happens in a vacuum, it's bad. It probably sounds worse now than it did to us 9 years ago. But if that was Carl's only offense, I don't think he's out of the league. It was the fact that he did that within a 4-year span of throwing Gugliotta and Corciani out of PNC. He had like a 2-year break where he never called an NC State basketball game. And his game back calling an NC State basketball game was at Reynolds. It was against Wofford. It was a Mike Young coached Wofford team. And he teed up Gottfried within the first 5 minutes of the game. I think we didn't even get to the media timeout, or it was going into the first media timeout. And I remember joking with people in the media after that game that Carl walked in, with the gun locked and loaded, and whoever was in his sights first was getting that technical. And it happened to be Gottfried in the first 5 minutes. And then State loses the game. And their fans were throwing trash on the court at Reynolds, trying to hit Carl as he left the floor. That incident with Mitt, like I said, like that's really bad. The fact that it was like strike 3 or strike 4, that's why he's been reffing a bunch of mid-major conference games. I don't think he does anymore, but I know I've talked to Steve Forbes about how Steve had to deal with him in the SoCon after the ACC gave him the boot, because the SoCon could get a experienced ref on the cheap, and he was still looking to work. It's funny how that played out there.
Yeah, I think there were probably about 100 other things on that list too, that we could go down a long list of offenses on the part of Carl. The fact that he is still reffing, or even after that whole thing, just blows my mind sometimes. I can deal with Teddy Valentine and you're right. Teddy does call a decent game, but it's a little more theatrical. I almost feel like it's some of the umpires in baseball these days.
Yeah.
It's out of hand. It's like, why are you throwing people out of games, man? I don't,
I shouldn't be able to look at the screen and, based on the way you call a travel, know exactly who you are as a referee. Like, travel calls should not have signature movements to them. And I think that every time I see Teddy call a travel.
Yeah.
And whenever your favorite thing during a game, the replay, whenever that's on, he loves them right there.
He loves them. And it pains me because Ron Gruber is one of my favorite refs in the league, but Ron will replay everything under the sun if he's given the opportunity.
Let's skip over. Let's skip over some of these the coaches, because we've got a long list of coaches here to go into.
I threw some coaches in there.
Yeah, all well deserved. Thank you very much. We're going to go to the intern faux pas, where single points of failure are not acceptable in business. However, in this particular case, the ACC Media Guide. Oh boy, did that one really hit social media? Wow.
Yeah, I had a copy, and it's funny that we talk about this this week because that the scene of the crime, if you will, the day that everybody found out that it said that on page 145 was when ACC kickoff was at Pinehurst. I had a copy of that media guide. I don't know if I have it anymore. I don't. I've moved like 3 or 4 times since then. I don't know if it got lost in a move or if I left it in a office where I previously worked. But man, I I just it was one of those things like you try to explain to people that are too dialed into Twitter now what it was like back then when you could be in an office with 4 people working and maybe only one of them was looking at Twitter and like hitting the refresh button. And I still remember being in Burlington and we had come back from that day in Pinehurst and we had seen people talking about what was on the media guide. And I remember rushing to my media guide that I had brought back and seeing like, oh my God, mine says it too. Like, this is ridiculous.
Just for the benefit of, we always try to keep it sort of family oriented, sort of. Let me encourage you to go to Devils Illustrated and read this article. My take, who else should have been invited to ACC meetings if you want to find out what it specifically said in the ACC media guide.
Yeah. Then you'll kind of be in on every inside joke when you see page 145 referenced by any media members.
Yes.
That's what page 145 is. That's when you're just fed up and can't take it anymore. Yep. Whether you just finished typing in all of the previous season's results and scores from football or any other busy work that could be on your mind.
Oh, and 9 years later, we still talk about it.
Yeah, and to be clear, so there are people who know the identity of the person who typed that. Oh. I am not one of them. I am guessing that it was an intern. So I'll put that out there because.
Well, we'll say it's an intern.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just they probably weren't. I assume that's intern level work, and I assume that's intern level professionalism.
I don't want anybody getting fired.
Yeah. I was just going to assume there probably weren't an intern much longer after that.
Yeah. Right, and that's the thing. Like, if they're still working for the ACC 9 years later, I think they were safe.
Yeah.
we should hope so. But that's some funny stuff. I remember that to this day. And when you brought that up, I it's something that goes out of your mind. But the second I saw that, I was like, oh my God, yes, I remember this. This was a huge, huge thing. Everybody was talking about it. Let's get into some coaches, man. We got a lot of coaches here, and covers everything from basketball to football. Let's talk about Roy first.
Roy was just a fun one to throw in there, and I tried to make it as light as possible because I really do envy the life that he leads now. Just play as much golf as you can and go to as many live sporting events as you can. I mean, like, that's the dream.
Yeah.
I'm waiting on somebody to hire Wanda, his wife, as a consultant for a basketball coach hire, because she's got to know more basketball than most media. She sees more games than all of us. Like, she's there. And you know that her and Roy aren't just sitting there for the entire game talking about their grandkids and whatnot. Like, she's got to be picking up something.
Oh yeah.
But timeout usage. I mean, I didn't reference the 2008 Final Four game. It was at Kansas. I think they fell behind by a ton.
Mm-hmm.
that's the one that comes to mind when you talk about timeouts and Roy Williams. Still 16 years later, like that's the game. It's just a fun one, and it's a look. Roy was Dean in every sense of how he could be Dean. He was Dean, and Dean didn't call momentum break timeouts, so Roy didn't call momentum break timeout. Like it just that's the way it went for one, and that's the way it went for the other now.
How to effectively or not use your timeouts.
He expected the team to try to work his way out of it. I mean, that's what it was.
And every time I see a coach who refuses to call time, like I think there was a weight game late in the season where I thought I picked up on a vibe of that from Steve Forbes. It's just kind of like, yeah, I actually do agree with this. Like your team needs to be able to pull itself out when they're on the 28th game of the season. Like you're not calling a timeout to get them in the huddle and tell them anything they don't already know. So you need to be able to communicate that on the court.
That's right.
But then, going back a ways, you all remember Pete Gillen, who used them like they were, dollar bills at the club.
Yeah. Yeah. Back when you got 5 of them and Pete would get to the last 3 minutes of games with 1.
I don't understand your
And then
reference.
by that time they were down like 20 points.
We'll have to explain your reference a little more in detail there, Will.
Get that money, man.
Yeah, that's right. Mo money. What is the portal again? Does anybody know? Well, one coach apparently doesn't. Who might that be? We all know.
Yeah, that one I got to the end of the list before I realized that he's the only acting head coach on the list. But it's startling, it's kind of confounding. On some levels it's understandable. But I ultimately wind up on being confused by Dabo Swinney just saying, I'm not going to use the transfer portal, basically. I get that you love the high school recruiting you do. I get that you love your culture. But I just think that look at what happened last year. Like Florida State passed you. Florida State is a better program in 1 year because of what Mike Norvell has done in pretty much 2 cycles of the portal. We don't even have to go back to the immediately after COVID years. We just look at what Mike Norvell did between the 21, 22 seasons and between 22, 23, bringing in Keon Coleman, bringing in the defensive lineman's name from Albany, Jared Verse.
Jared Verse, yep.
I mean, just look at those 2 guys. They're 2 monsters. You're telling me that Clemson can't bring in those types of impact players because they're in love with the 4-star kid that hasn't panned out yet and they're waiting on him to pan out? I just think Clemson is kind of being left in the dust and they're putting themselves at a competitive disadvantage. And that's where I land.
We also know Dabo's feelings about NIL.
I did not make any. Our program was built in the original NIL references.
Yep.
I didn't think those would fit, and I didn't want to really dig in too deep.
You don't want to shoehorn something that doesn't fit. Exactly.
Right.
But we all know what we're thinking here.
So we've got a coach or a former coach is basically, if he were to address the ACC today, it would be about how to make friends and influence people, especially in Greensboro. So we all know who this might be.
Yeah, I'll never forget, I'll never forgive on Jim Boeheim talking about there being no value in playing the ACC tournament in Greensboro. And I get it. Like he's the guy who is used to Madison Square Garden for Big East tournaments every year. And I understand it. But man, to say that about Greensboro is heresy in ACC country. It is, especially on Tobacco Road. So, and then, I get to make references. I don't think I actually called him real life Eeyore, but He, man, I got the feeling every time he talked for the entire time he was in the ACC, pretty much, it sounded like he had just been given the worst news of his life 5 minutes before the press conference. And that goes all the way through his last press conference, which was in that little Greensboro auditorium after he gets beat by Wake on a buzzer beater. And he tells everybody that, hey, basically, you guys are all idiots and you missed the fact that I already gave my retirement speech. You have
Okay.
Great journalists, Donna Datota and Mike Waters, are sitting there like, wait, are you kidding me? Like, what are you talking about? And then they try to confirm with him, and he just goes, "Oh no, it's up to the school. It's up to the school." So it's up to the school whether you retire or not. The school that you've been at for basically half a century, that you brought a national championship to, that you won 1,000 games for. It's up to them whether you keep coaching. That's not how it works.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sent a lot of mixed messages, and still to this day, I wonder about things because there's some things that have never been confirmed, and I'm just like, okay,
it'll either come out on a podcast or a book
sooner or later. Always does. Let's talk about how important fiber is in your life, especially moral fiber.
So like the one brief period that I did not live in North Carolina over the last 17 years, I lived in Arkansas for 3.5 months.
I'm sorry.
So I was actually, I wasn't living there when Bobby Petrino had the motorcycle accident. I got out of Dodge about 4 months earlier, but I still paid enough attention, had enough like interest in Arkansas. I remember following that from, whatever, 2 states away, or maybe 1 state. I mean, Tennessee is such a long state, right? I think it's just from Tennessee away, let's say. Man, that was wild. I just, and he got thrown a life jacket from Louisville and proceeded to have a nice run with Lamar Jackson, right? Like, got Louisville their first Heisman, and then just nosedived his program after Lamar left. I think that's the perfect guy to come in and talk to people about moral and ethics. And, if you strike out on him, then there's another former Louisville coach to bring in on that front.
Wow.
I was going to say that his hire of defensive coordinator was really tanked the program. I mean, that was one of the worst hires ever.
That one of the editing room floor names was Brian Van Gorder, but I thought that was too far into the weeds.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. It was like a Thursday or Friday night game. I want to say it was against like Georgia Tech or somebody where they hung like close to 70 on him or something like that.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, that 2018 season, I'll always remember. Wake's running back Matt Colburn was committed to Louisville for a long time, and I'm kicking myself for not throwing a Matt Colburn reference into the little Bobby Petrino nugget. But about 3 days before signing day, Louisville called Matt Colburn and told him they didn't have space for him anymore. They had, I think it was 2 defensive backs left unexpectedly, and they needed to bring in more in the secondary, and had to tell Matt that he would have to take a gray shirt. So in scramble mode, Matt decommitted, committed to Wake Forest, had a really nice career, and is actually still playing football. He's in the UFL. Going into that 2018 game, that was Matt's senior year, and he had a really good game against Louisville the year before. I talked to him before the game, like during that week. It was either Tuesday or Wednesday, and it was like, hey man, your last shot at Louisville, are there any personal emotions for you going into this one? He's like, no, it's all business. He had gotten his revenge the previous year. Like, it was just about Wake and about like that year they bounced from win to loss, win to loss. They never really strung together wins until the end of the season. So he was all about the whole, we need to bounce back. We need to make sure we play sound football, that kind of thing. We ran for like 260 yards on him and 3 touchdowns, 4 touchdowns maybe. After the first one, he threw up L's down in the end zone. He was fired up. And we get him after the game, and it's like, okay, Matt, same question. Were there any emotions or personal feelings for you coming into this game? And oh yeah, there were. Like,
Okay.
all right, well, there's my lesson is sometimes you have to ask the same question after the game happens, and you'll get something good, and it won't be the same answer.
Speaking of the same sandbox here, Tommy Elrod, more isn't always better.
Yeah, that one, I knew that one would be at the bottom for a while. I wanted to end with a really good one. I went and talked to Tommy when I was like 2 months into the job in Winston-Salem when they played Louisville. It's just always, it's kind of been my white whale. I guess in my time at the Journal, I was only at the Journal for 3 years. I'd like to say I have 2 white whales. One was Danny Manning's buyout, figuring out if it was really the $18 million that Jeff Goodman reported it, and nobody could ever tell me with any authority whether it was or wasn't true. The other white whale is figuring out Tommy Elrod's motives. I still don't know. I don't know if he benefited gambling wise. You know, this was a decade ago or so that he was giving away trade secrets. Sports gambling wasn't legal, but it's not that it didn't happen. Exactly. So we don't have to beat around that bush. I've always wanted to know if he benefited financially from it. I'm 98% sure he has a non-disclosure agreement that prevents him from ever talking about it. That seems to be Wake's modus operandi. They would rather sweep it under the rug than to have more of the story come out. So yeah. But you know, media access at Wake Forest is still, comparatively to other ACC schools, it's still better than most. We get to watch every practice in the spring that we want. We get to watch every practice in fall camp up until they start putting in install. But pre-WikiLeaks, they got to watch everything, man. They got to watch game planning stuff. They got to watch, you know, Thursday walkthroughs, I think. They saw it all.
Wow.
And you had a guy who was a former Wake player. He was on Jim Grobe's staff, and Dave Clawson did not retain him. Wake gave him a lifeline and put him on the radio broadcast crew. According to people I've talked to, like, he did a good job as an analyst. But then it comes out that he was going to these practices and telling buddies in the coaching industry, you know, what Wake was running out of certain formations, what trick plays were in the install that week. You know, that kind of thing. Yeah. So that's why Tommy Elrod is very equipped to come in and tell you the benefits of more media access.
Yeah. It still blows me away, that whole thing. And I'm always impressed by how people in the media come up so quickly with things like WikiLeaks, because I thought that, you know, that was so perfect.
I think that was well timed. I think that was Sam Walker, journalist down on the Outer Banks.
Yeah,
I think to give the proper credit there. I think that was his baby. Yeah, you're right, Jim. Like that was, I think, floated and immediately like shot up, and that's what everybody called it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Excellent stuff. The 2 people that were on X that were mentioned, and I think that we need to throw them in here because I think both of them deserve mention. One of them is in regard to building programs, and the other is brevity. Um, and I thought to myself, oh my God, both of these are perfect and dead on. Um, Go ahead, tell us about building programs. Who should come in and talk to the ACC about building programs?
Yeah, I think it's the worst basketball coach that the ACC has ever had. I've had this conversation. I can't remember which. I apologize if it's with you guys. I know I've had this conversation with somebody. When you talk about the worst ACC basketball coaches, you need to have two tiers of it. And you need to have one tier for the guys that didn't even make it through a full recruiting cycle. Now, granted, nowadays recruiting cycle is completely different meaning, but for these intents and purposes, like you need to have guys that didn't even make it through a full recruiting class. And that's where this guy falls. Like Kevin Stallings, I mean, those were two disastrous seasons. It took Jeff Capel, what, 3 or 4 years just to piece together the program back to being mediocre. But Kevin Stallings, I mean, that was a hire that didn't make sense to most people at the start. It continued to baffle through. He went winless, I think, in his first season in the ACC. One of those 2 seasons he was winless in the league. I can't remember if it was the first or second one, but
Second one.
That was the second one.
Yeah. I think that was the 18 year, I think it was, when Virginia held him to like 8 points in the first half.
Oh, yeah, that sounds familiar. And is the reason that they weren't winless in the first year he was there was because he had Cam Johnson?
Probably.
Yeah. And then tried to block Cam Johnson, which now we can look at that and really laugh at. Like, coaches actually blocked players from being eligible, or tried to in this case. But yeah, I mean, Kevin Stallings.
He watching the players on that team on the court, they always look so defeated. They look disgusted. They look like they did not want to try. They'd given up by the end of the season, and that all comes back to him. And the fact that he has moved on to other things, boy, there's no way in the world I would touch a guy like him, no matter how successful he may be in the future. So, not with that mindset. Let's talk about brevity, because, man, there's a couple other things that apply here as well. But brevity, yeah.
Yeah, like I said about throwing it all the way back to what I said about Teddy with I know it's a travel call. When I look at Ted, if you turn on an AC basketball game in the middle of the game, and in the first 8 seconds, let's say you hear something about Oak Hill or just anything involving the first person, like me, Corey Alexander's on the game.
Yep. It's insufferable.
Yeah.
When I saw today that Virginia was playing Florida in the ACC SEC Challenge, all I could think about was the end of the game in Charlotte when he was like telling the refs that they made the wrong call, and I'm just sitting here like, oh.
No place for, and we talked about this when it happened. There is no place for somebody who is in that position professionally to do that. He stepped so far out of bounds on that. Whether he was right or wrong doesn't make any difference. It's not his place to open his mouth about that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's the biggest problem I had with it, was from an early age, or early in your career in sports journalism, you're told, don't make yourself part of the story.
Yep.
It's like the golden rule. Don't make yourself part of the story.
That's part of the reason why anytime we're in a press box or on the sideline, you don't root for your team.
Mm-hmm.
If you're covering a game, you don't root. And you can do it in your head, but don't do it openly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, interesting. I'll tell you what, that list, Conor, is just, I mean, and you're right. We could get into the weeds on all of these and more. I mean, there's a long list, and it's funny. It starts taking off, and once you open that door, I'm sure that anybody who's either reading the article, hearing this, is going, "Oh, do you remember this and this?" And it snowballs. It's unreal. Yeah. So this may have to be a regular thing for you to do from now on.
Oh, man. I just want to throw it out there for the suggestions. Like,
oh yes,
I want to know everybody else's thoughts. Like, I have a couple that I saved in the chamber. I want to see if anybody names those, and I don't know if I can do this every year. Well, I need summer content every year, right?
There we go.
And as long as I'm not making a trip to Omaha, like, this time of the year is free all the time.
Mm-hmm. I mean, what else are we going to do in the middle?
It's finally the end of the roster churn. Like, so.
Yeah. Say, what else are we going to do in the middle of June?
Watch baseball. That's it.
Yeah.
I'm going to enjoy, as much as I love being out in Omaha last year, I'm going to enjoy watching Omaha from the comforts of home and vacation over the next, 2 weeks.
Yeah. Nice break. And a deserved break, too. So, with Tommy Elrod, I will just say that, if he has an NDA, maybe you can break it with some defamation. That'll get that out in the open.
I went to his house and he answered the door, and it was probably the most polite, not in these words, but it was the most polite way of saying, "Get the hell out of here. Like, I have no time for you." I asked him, I can't remember the way I phrased it. I think I asked him if he had time to talk to me about it, and he told me he could not. So
fair enough. A different stream. Oh my. Anyway, you gave it a shot, and that's all we can ask. So that's good. Yeah. Thank you so much for writing this article. I'm just like I said, I enjoyed it so much. Yeah. I've been chuckling all along and hearing you talk about some of these folks and their picadillos. It's so funny because it just brings all of this up, and you're going, yeah. And then you start, like I said, you start getting into the weeds, and the next thing you know, it just goes, brevity. Yes, Corey Alexander. Anyway, so on that note, Conor O'Neill, the publisher of Deacons and Devils Illustrated on the Rivals Network, our special guest, and make sure that you check out the article, My Take, Who Else Should Have Been Invited to ACC Meetings. Make sure that you check this out also on X. If you look up Conor on X, you'll see this thing posted, and then you can add your thoughts about who should also be included on this esteemed list, because it's esteemed for sure. Conor, thanks so much, man, for at the last minute jumping in and sharing some fun with us here. It's good to see you as always. Good to hear, and thanks again for the laugh.
Sure, thanks, guys, and I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, appreciate it, Conor.
Thanks for listening to ACC Nation. Be sure to listen, like and subscribe to our podcast, radio, and YouTube channels by visiting accnation.net. Follow us on Instagram, X, Facebook, Mastodon, Threads, Blue Sky and Reddit at ACC Nation.
ACC Nation.